Hello and welcome to the History of Bangalore. I am Ramjee Chandran, bringing you episode 45 of season 1, the early medieval period, and this is part 10 of my series on the Hoysalas. In the last episode, Vishnuvardhana had just died. Despite decades of effort marked by an untiring and pitiless series of battles, Vishnuvardhana was unable to realize his lifelong ambition of breaking free from his overlords, the Western Chalukyas. But he died after having weakened the Chalukyas enough that squabbles had broken out among the feudatories, leaving a huge political mess for the successors of Vikramaditya VI to resolve. And of course, having to constantly look over their shoulder because the threat now was less external than it was internal, meaning that their greatest nemesis was the Hoysalas. And this episode moves on from the great Hoysala Vishnuvardhana. But before it does, a word of thanks to the Prestige Group for helping me make this podcast possible through their corporate sponsorship. Building cities one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. The question historians ask, when did Vishnuvardhana die? One view is that he died in Bankapura in 1142. Some say that he died more than a decade later, but what confuses everyone is there are inscriptions of grants that he made extending to something like a dozen years after he died. But these have been explained as Vishnuvardhana's name being mentioned because he had made those grants before he died. So we'll stick to 1142. But this quibble aside, the greater issue concerns his successor, Narasimha I. The issue was that he was only 8 years old when he took the throne in 1142, and his reign had been less than stellar. This is a point in the narration of this slice of history when there's a choice between dismissing Narasimha as a weak and vicious ruler and looking at the human side of this so-called weak and vicious streak. So let's do the latter. Narasimha I was born to Vishnuvardhana and his wife Lakshmi in 1133. He was not the oldest child of Vishnuvardhana. His older sibling named Ballala or Ballala Deva had died. There's an opinion that this Ballala Deva was the child of the famed Queen Shantala, and in the last episode, I went over the tragic love story of Vishnu and Shantala, a heartwarming story. Do find some time to listen to it if you haven't. The reign of Narasimha is seen as something of a setback for the Hoysalas, especially after that high-fuel campaign of Vishnuvardhana towards achieving independence. And while many historians have tried to make Narasimha's reign a footnote to their history, there are some management lessons to be derived from looking at his situation. Many modern-day corporations fret about developing a good second line of management. Everyone's heard this phrase. And this is especially true of owner or family-led companies that have grown in size and now need professional management. This was no less true of medieval kingdoms. Politics back in the medieval day depended entirely on individual personalities, especially the kings. And the events following Vishnuvardhana tell this story. Here's why. Let's start with the fact that Narasimha was only 8 years old when he became king. And this raises the question, so what? Even if Vishnuvardhana's successor was only an 8-year-old boy, surely the same ministers who served him could have carried on the work of the kingdom, right? Well, not quite. And this is where the issue of management depth and managerial competence kicks in. Clearly, the Hoysala kingdom did not comprise good managers like some other kingdoms did, like the Vatapi Chalukyas, the Choras, and others spring to mind. In Narasimha's court, even the most capable and honest ministers could not really run the kingdom because they appear to be completely ineffective without the direct leadership of the king. There was no concept of collective responsibility among these people who served their royal masters. They served only on the king's command, so without the king they were not competent to rise to the task, unable to meet the challenges on their own, and so, as we know only too well, when the hand of a strong king is not available, managers fall to petty rivalries, jealousies, and suspicion, making governance a nightmare, a fractured and unstable affair, a mess in short. So, Narasimha's reign was marked by weaknesses, inadequacy, and failure. Admittedly, when he ascended the throne, the young boy was put in the middle of a pretty messy situation. When Vishnuvardhana had moved his campaigns to the northern territories, it must have cost the kingdom substantially, logistics being only one of the challenges. And then there was the risk of retaliation from the different principalities of the north, who seemed to be united in their effort to oppose him, even though they were disunited in every other manner. Now, as long as the Hoysala forces had a strong leader like Vishnu and heady from a string of victories, it is understandable that battle became second nature to them. And think of it like this: they went to battle like you and I might commute to work, and the goal of battle becomes their life. But when Vishnuvardhana died, it was an invitation for the northern allies to push the Hoysalas right out of that Trans-Tungabhadra province. Now let's remember, all this visited a young boy who was just coming of age, coming to grips with his own maturity, but he must have grown up very, very quickly. And the next 20 years, that's between 1142 and 1162, were 2 decades that no human being should count as their coming-of-age years. All of Vishnuvardhana's northern gains looked like they were completely lost, Hangal being a prime example. Both banks of the Tungabhadra fell into the hands of the Sindha rulers, and all this was only in the first 2 years. A Hoysala campaign towards the north resulted in no real gain. And then there was trouble with the Chengalbas, the chieftaincy in the southwest Deccan around Coorg and parts of Malenadu, and that had to be quelled. But when the level of chaos descends to outright lawlessness in the land, cattle raids, border skirmishes, and the like, administratively speaking, these are signs of a total lack of respect for the state. Politically speaking, Narasimha decided that he was not going to follow his father's footsteps towards seeking independence from the Chalukyas, and he remained quite content to rule as a faithful feudatory to the Chalukya kingdom. Now there is a long list of battles that range from skirmishes to major conflict in the years that followed in Narasimha's reign, but they are all of little relevance to us as they mostly occurred towards the north of the territory and very little in what concerns us in Bangalore so much, which is Gangavadi and Nolambavadi. But still, in the end, the measure of the man Narasimha should take into account that by 1163 AD, he had managed to consolidate several, if not all, of his father's gains, although some still complained that the kingdom did shrink in size. But what concerns us the most is the inscription that by 1167 AD, Gangavadi and Nolambavadi, which is the territory around Bangalore, were also secured, and that Narasimha's dominion had extended as far as the Kongu lands, which is the general area around Coimbatore. The size of the kingdom aside, it would also seem that by this time, administration had settled down, and there was mention of 3 brothers, Hulja, Lakshmanaras, and Amareshwara, who ran the kingdom efficiently for Narasimha. So we know that Narasimha started with bad management. Now, could there be a downside to good management bandwidth? Well, it looked like there was. Free of the daily duties of running a kingdom and the ravages of petty conflict and coming to terms with his lack of experience and his youth, it would seem that Narasimha decided, now that everything was settled, it was time to catch up on his adolescent pursuits that had evaded him while he grew up. So around 1160 AD, Narasimha became a playboy, and by 1161 it is written that he was cavorting with 384 women, and he stayed a playboy until he died over a decade later. One inscription described his indulgence and escapades in this rather entertaining way, and I quote, "The royal swans sporting in the lake of the Andhra women, the sun to the lotus faces of the Sinhala women, the golden zone to the waists of the Kannada women, the ornaments stamped with musk on the cheeks of the Gujarati women, the saffron paste on the goblets of the breasts of the Chora women, the moon to the water lilies of the eyes of the Bengal women, the wave on the beauty of the Bangla girls, and the bee to the scent and pollen of the lotuses of the faces of the Malava women. What a guy. Narasimha died in 1173 AD, and he was still 40 years old. One historian didn't like Narasimha very much. It was the stern and presumably virtuous historian Krishnaswamy Iyengar who laughably offered the gratuity that Narasimha had died young because of his loose morality. Well, one wishes that at least he did so with a smile on his face. And now for a commercial break, and when I come back, the story of how Ballala II, or Veera Ballala, unseated his errant father and took the throne. Right after this.
Maximum connectivity, maximum luxury, maximum lifestyle. Live your max at Prestige Raintree Park. Opulent residences nestled in 21 acres of breathtaking landscape with 1 lakh plus square feet of clubhouse, 3 swimming pools, and ample leisure and sports amenities. Experience exquisite living at Prestige Raintree Park in prime Whitefield with schools, offices, hospitals, and shopping malls just a hop away. Call 81399 81399 or visit prestigeconstructions.com to know more. RADA approved.
Hi, I'm back. Veera Ballala's ambition for the Hoysala throne started very early. He challenged his father for the throne even by 1165. As I said before the break, Narasimha was already in his sensual alternate life by the early 1160s and left the field open for his son, and Ballala decided that he would revolt against his father. This is almost a parallel of what had happened when the Rashtrakuta King Govinda II decided that he would spend the rest of his life pursuing women and abdicated in favor of his brother Dhruva Dharavarsha around 780 AD. I captured all that in a previous episode. But going ahead, what we know of any of this regarding Ballala is from an inscription in 1173 AD that spoke of Ballala having left his father, and by this we infer that he must have decided to step into the administrative void left by Narasimha and declare his own independence. There is little to no evidence that Narasimha resisted his son's moves, and therefore it would look like there was an abdication in everything but name. There is also some mention that he may have been unwell and actually had handed responsibility to Ballala as a regency with Mahadevi, the queen, in or around 1167 AD. Technically, Ballala II assumed the crown only when Narasimha had died, and that was in 1173. But a combination of uncertainty and impatience probably drove Ballala to take action before. The impatience, it must be noted, would have had less to do with career advancement from crown prince to king, but the fact that in his inattentive phases, Narasimha was letting opportunity after opportunity slip by to declare independence from the Chalukyas. And this opportunity was because the decade of the 1160s saw the last days of the Kalyani Chalukyas. After years of battering by the Hoysalas and watching their feudatories fighting and squabbling among themselves and with the overlords themselves, the Chalukyas faced their final threat from the Kalachuris. For context moving forward, here's a brief timeline of the collapse and fall of the Western Chalukyas. At their peak under Vikramaditya VI, the Kalyani Chalukyas were unstoppable with victories over the Choras and a strong empire. But after he died in 1126, weaker rulers like Someshwara III and Tailappa III failed to hold things together, and powerful feudatories saw opportunities arise. Now the first to make a dent were the Kalachuris, when in 1156 AD, Bijala II overthrew Chalukya Tailappa III and seized Kalyana, the Chalukya capital. Whatever weird deal was struck between them, it resulted in Bijala ruling, but in the Chalukya's name. But in fact, he effectively had ended the Chalukya dominance. This is a bit confusing. Nonetheless, when Bijala died in 1167, the Chalukyas attempted a comeback under Someshwara, but it was too late. The Hoysalas in the south, the Yadavas or the Siyunas from the north, were already eating into Chalukya lands. By the 1180s, rulers like Ballala and Bilamma V of the Yadavas had eaten heavily into Chalukya territory. And finally, in 1189, Someshwara IV lost Kalyana and the entire dynasty collapsed. The Chalukyas were done. Their territories were carved up and divided among the Hoysalas, the Siyona Yadavas, and the Kalachuris. And this set the stage for the Hoysalas to become the dominant power in the Deccan when they finally overcame the others and declared themselves sovereign in 1193. There is little point speculating on what might have happened if Narasimha had paid more attention to the kingdom instead of to his harem, but clearly, the way things were lined up, one might speculate that the Hoysalas might have got there sooner. But what we can reasonably assume is that Ballala was impatient because he watched his dad fritter away opportunities and therefore he revolted. Local feudatories like the Chengalvas and some military leaders helped him in his goal. He made one famous incursion into Malenadu and ingratiated himself to the local chiefs over there. There was a skirmish and one of the generals loyal to Narasimha lost his life. And then you remember I mentioned something about cattle raids and lawlessness in the final years of Narasimha, and that was with the knowledge and possibly encouragement of Ballala. The day finally came when Narasimha died, and Ballala was crowned king of the Hoysalas on the 21st of July, 1173. To understand the scope of what these kings had to endure and what they were made of before we rush to judgment about them, we have heard the tale of Narasimha, who was only 8 years old when he became king. Ballala was not much older. He was born in 1150, and from the titles accorded to him, we know that he was involved in the early skirmishes against the Kalachuris even when he was just an adolescent boy. Historian Derrett had an interesting way of putting it, and I quote, "If he was too young then to criticize his father's conduct of affairs, he was old enough to be stirred by the tales he would hear of his grandfather, tales which, however exaggerated, could not fail to portray a great man and an ancestor of whom he might be justly proud." The years that Ballala had exercised his regency with Mahadevi had started in 1167 when he was 17 years old. By the time he was 22, which was in 1172, he was already blooded in battle and experienced with the craft of kingship, and now he became dissatisfied with his father's seeming apathy and inaction. The path of the Hoysalas to take over the entire Deccan happened in the next 20 years. And here's how it went. Until 1189, the Chalukyas made every desperate effort to stave off their demise. And the other players in the drama were, as I mentioned earlier, the Hoysalas, the Kalachuris, and the Siyonas or the Yadavas. By 1173, Ballala's ambition had found wings. Having become king, he started calling himself Veera Ballala. Next, understanding the value of PR, he employed or patronized a number of court poets. Some of them, like Janna, became historically renowned. Janna was called Kavi Chakravarti, or Emperor of Poets. And all or some of these poets helped Ballala set the tone of his dynasty. One example is the unusual number of inscriptions and mentions in Kannada literature about Ballala's successful military campaigns against the Uchangi Pandyas. The taking of the Uchangi Durga fort has been recited so much that Ballala himself was drawn into the maw of all the PR and then relocated briefly to Uchangi. The events around the Chalukya Empire over the next many years were nothing more than deadly cat-and-mouse games with lines drawn and redrawn, alliances made and broken, pointless battle, loss of lives, and wanton destruction. And it was then in 1189 AD that a path opened up for Ballala. When those mighty western Chalukyas had fallen, their once grand empire had been carved up among the Hoysalas, Kalachuris, and Siyonas, as we saw, but Ballala had no intention of sharing the spoils. In 1190, after a brief truce with some of the others had come to a close, Ballala struck. He went north with precision, with fury. He crushed the Siyona commanders at Soratur, drove their forces through the hills to Lokigundi, and he seized the Ballala region. Now that victory at Lokigundi in 1192 marked a turning point. The fort was very hard to capture, just as Uchangi it was, but Ballala did capture it, and the court poets had more to work with now. Their joyous and florid description of the battle went like this. When King Bhilama came and met him, saying, "I have a multitude of elephants and warriors, I have a force of horses, I have soldiers who will fight in war, who will dare come to grips with me?" King Ballala, crying aloud, pushed forward that famous elephant, thrashed the enemy's army, thoroughly trampled on it, and pursued and flogged it from Soratur right up to Lokigundi. Did he not? That last flourish was in the inscription. In 1193, Ballala turned west to Banavasi and Hangal, where he met strong resistance from the Kadamba king Kamadeva, and he was in fact beaten back a little bit. But undeterred, Ballala crushed all dissent, subdued Rattihalli, Bandaleke and Gutti, and he silenced all rebellion in Banavasi. Now his rivals, who were continuing to squabble among themselves, fell one by one. By 1195, Ballala's conquest had brought him to Kalyana, right at the door of the heart of the former Chalukya Empire. And now with his expansion complete, the Hoysala Empire, once just a regional player, now stood as the dominant force from the Deccan. And Ballala II was no longer just a regional ruler, he was now Emperor, Chakrabarti. In the next few episodes, I take you through what Ballala did with the kingdom, and then starts the period of decline into a situation that saw the advent of the Vijayanagara and the Bahmani kingdoms into the region. And the history of the Deccan would change suddenly in a way that it had not for over 1,000 years. Stay tuned to this podcast for those episodes. They're going to be compelling. And in the meantime, signing out for today, I am Ramjee Chandran, and this is the History of Bangalore.